Tin Hut Platoon! Fall in to hear about the production of the story of G.I. Joe and insight into its restoration. Let's call it the story of G.I. Joe. Drawn from the frontline dispatches of war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who was not interested at all in generals or great battles, but in the lowly foot soldiers of the infantry. Embedded in several units in North Africa, Italy, and later the Pacific, his stories celebrated the little guy, persevering in the face of an impossible situation. Born in Indiana in 1900, Pyle quit Indiana University one semester before graduation when offered a job reporting for the county newspaper. For the next dozen years, he traveled the country for the Scripps Howard Syndicate, writing human interest stories. In doing this, he honed the down-home, simple writing style that would make him famous. He knew the great, but always preferred the small. Director William Wellman, who relished his reputation as Wild Bill Wellman and had won the first Best Picture Oscar for his silent film Wings in 1927, was not at first interested in the project at all. But after spending a few days with Pyle at his home in Albuquerque and seeing the reverence with which he was treated by servicemen they encountered, he relented. Production began in March of 1944. Scenes, characters, dialogue, and all narration would be drawn directly from Ernie's dispatches, published in book form as Here Is Your War and Brave Men. Despite producer and studio pressure to hire a star, as they always do, Wellman selected Broadway veteran Burgess Meredith to play Ernie Pyle. Meredith had given a memorable performance in 1939 in Of Mice and Men. Temporarily released from the Army Air Forces to make the film, his humble portrayal and resemblance to Pyle proved Wellman right. He is best known to modern audiences as the first Penguin and as Rocky Balboa's cantankerous trainer. Which brings us to our first restoration example. This shot is typical of most of the film. It may not look too bad until you see what some image steadying, grain management, and deflicker can do. In many cases, we were able to restore the film to nearly what it looked like when released in 1945, although some shots were more challenging than others. Ideally, you'd want to use the camera negative, but that had rotted away years ago. So our transfer was made from a recent preservation element made by the Motion Picture Academy's Pickford Center from a duplicate nitrate negative that was in good but not terrific shape. In fact, the last shot had to be reclaimed from a 16mm print. So our element was a third-generation dupe, which meant that all the fades and dissolves were now fourth generation, and it showed. The degradation is most apparent in skies where there's no detail for the grain to grab onto. Fortunately, we know a few tricks. The film contains actual combat footage shot by the Signal Corps. As it is necessarily all handheld, some shots needed a little help. Striving for authenticity in all areas of production, Wellman convinced the Army to loan him 150 actual combat veterans from the North African and Italian campaigns. After victory in Europe, they were sent to the Pacific. In the scene where Ernie learns, indifferently, that he's won a Pulitzer Prize, the other actors were themselves actual war correspondents. Freddie Steele, the world middleweight boxing champ from 1936 to 38, plays Sergeant Steve Warnicki, who tries throughout the film to play a recording of his son's voice, then loses his grip on reality when he finally hears it. The bride in the wedding scene was played by Wellman's actress wife, Dorothy. This was Robert Mitchum's first major role after years in bit parts. Cast when director Wellman saw him walking by the studio, the film made Mitchum a star and garnered the only Academy Award nomination of his career. He would go on to be indelibly associated with film noir. The character of Lieutenant Walker was based entirely on the real Captain Henry Waskow. The final scene was taken directly from Pyle's most famous column. The mule stood there, in the road where the trail came down off the mountain. This one is Captain Waskow, one soldier said quietly. Two men unleashed his body from the mule and lifted it off and laid it in the shadow. The men in the road seemed reluctant to leave. They stood around, and gradually, one by one, I could sense them moving closer to Captain Waskow's body. Not so much to look, I think, as to say something in finality to him and to themselves. One soldier came and looked down, and he said out loud, "God damn it." That's all he said, and then he walked away. Another one came. He said, "God damn it to hell anyway." He He looked down for a few last moments, and then he turned and left. Another man came. I think he was an officer. The man looked down into the dead captain's face, and then he spoke directly to him as though he were alive. He said, "I'm sorry, old man." Then a soldier came, and he too spoke to his dead captain, not in a whisper, but tenderly, and he said, "I sure am sorry, sir." Then the first man squatted, and he reached down and took the dead hand, and he sat there for a full 5 minutes, holding the dead hand in his own and looking intently into the dead face, and he never uttered a sound all the time he sat there. And finally he put the hand down, and then reached up and gently straightened the points of the captain's shirt collar. And then he got up and walked away down the road, all alone. The story of G.I. Joe was released in June 1945 to critical and popular acclaim, but Ernie never saw it. He was shot by a sniper 2 months to the day before the premiere. On a tiny Japanese island, a monument stands on the very spot he was killed. Ernie Pyle was the most famous war correspondent in history. Folks stateside depended on him to put a human face on the war and give them news of their men so far away. His effect on home front morale is incalculable. Today, a monument to his memory stands on the grounds of Indiana University. Now, appropriately, we'll close with Ernie's own words.
And for those beneath the wooden crosses, there is nothing we can do, except perhaps to pause and murmur, "Thanks, pal."